Do that. I haven't really resisted influences. They're just maybe not that visible where someone can say, oh, she just borrowed that from so-and-so. It's a balance to.
There was a time when the most powerful voice in rock didn't shout, didn't strut, and didn't demand attention. It simply sat at a piano and told the truth. And yet behind that quiet voice was a story filled with tension, betrayal, and men who tried sometimes gently, sometimes forcefully, to shape the course of her life and her music. Carole King didn't arrive like a storm. She arrived like a slow sunrise. But make no mistake, what followed would change the sound of an entire generation. Before the sold-out crowds, before Tapestry became a permanent fixture in American homes, there was a young woman in Brooklyn navigating a world that wasn't built to let her lead. She wrote hits for others before she ever believed she could stand alone. And along the way, 5 men, each powerful in his own way, left marks on her journey. Some opened doors, others closed them. Some loved her, others tried to control her. But every one of them played a role in shaping the woman who would eventually sit alone at a piano and say more with a whisper than most could with a scream. This is not just a story about music. It's a story about influence, about quiet resilience, and about the unseen battles behind one of the most familiar voices America has ever known. And if you listen closely, you'll hear something beneath the melodies, a tension that never quite fades, and a strength that never needed permission. Carole King was born Carole Joan Klein on the 9th of February 1942 in Brooklyn, New York, a place where ambition was loud, fast, and often unforgiving. But she wasn't loud. She wasn't flashy. From the very beginning, she was something else entirely: quiet, observant, almost invisible in a room full of bigger personalities. Yet behind that calm exterior was a mind that heard music differently. By the time she was a teenager, she was already writing songs that others twice her age couldn't match. At just 17, she met a young lyricist named Gerry Goffin, and together they would form one of the most successful songwriting partnerships of the early 1960s. Inside the walls of Brill Building, they became hitmakers, crafting songs for other artists while remaining largely unknown to the public. It was a strange kind of success. Her voice was everywhere, yet no one knew her name. But behind the scenes, the partnership that defined her early career was already beginning to fracture. Fame came quickly, but stability did not. Relationships blurred with business, and the line between love and control became harder to see. As the hits piled up, so did the pressure. And slowly, quietly, Carole King began to realize that the life she was building might not truly belong to her. The woman who would one day redefine personal storytelling in music was at this point still living inside someone else's narrative. And the men around her, brilliant, flawed, and often overwhelming, would each pull her in different directions before she finally found her own voice. Number 5. Gerry Goffin. Gerry Goffin was the first man who truly understood what Carole King could hear before anyone else did, and that was exactly what made him so dangerous to her sense of self. When they met, they were young, ambitious, and moving faster than either of them could fully control. Together, they became a machine inside the Brill Building, writing hit after hit that would define early 1960s pop. On paper, it looked like a perfect partnership, his words, her melodies. But behind the success, something far more complicated was unfolding. Gerry didn't just collaborate with Carole. He began to dominate the emotional space around her. Their relationship blurred quickly, from professional to deeply personal, and before long, marriage and parenthood entered the picture, while their careers were still accelerating. The pressure was relentless. Deadlines, expectations, and the unspoken rule that Carole would always be the quiet half of the duo. But silence has a cost. As Gerry's ambitions grew, so did the distance between them. His personal struggles, his affairs, and his increasingly unpredictable behavior created a tension that Carole could no longer ignore. The man who once helped bring her music to life was now pulling her further away from her own center. And perhaps the hardest part wasn't the betrayal, it was the realization that the voice she had been helping to build all along had never truly been hers. Walking away from Gerry wasn't just the end of a marriage. It was the beginning of something far more uncertain, a moment Carole King would have to decide if she could exist without someone else shaping her story. Number 4. Don Kirshner. Don Kirshner didn't need to raise his voice to control a room. He controlled it with decisions, quiet, calculated, and final. And for Carole King, he represented something far more subtle than conflict. He represented a system. Inside the Brill Building, Kirshner was the gatekeeper, the man who decided which songs mattered and which ones disappeared before they were ever heard. To many, he was a genius of organization, a man who could turn raw talent into chart-topping success. But to Carole, he was also a constant reminder that her voice, her real voice, was not what the system wanted. He wanted hits. Predictable, reliable, marketable hits. And Carole delivered them again and again, often without question. But each success came with a quiet compromise. She wasn't writing for herself. She was writing for a machine that didn't have room for vulnerability, for hesitation, or for the kind of honesty that would later define her. Kirshner didn't oppose her outright. He didn't have to. The structure he built did that for him. It rewarded conformity and discouraged risk, and for years, Carole played her part perfectly. But something was changing. The more she succeeded within his system, the more she began to feel trapped by it. The songs were getting bigger, but her world was getting smaller. And at some point, the question became impossible to ignore. What would happen if she stopped writing for approval and started writing for herself? Don Kirshner never forced Carole King to stay where she was. He simply made it very difficult to imagine leaving. Number 3. James Taylor. James Taylor didn't enter Carole King's life like a storm. He arrived quietly, almost like a reflection of who she might become if she finally stepped out from behind the curtain. By the time their paths crossed in California, Carole was already carrying the weight of everything she had left behind in New York: a broken marriage, a career built on other people's voices, and a growing uncertainty about where she truly belonged. James was different from the men who came before him. He didn't try to control the room. He didn't demand direction. Instead, he brought something far more unsettling. He made vulnerability visible. And for Carole, that was both inspiring and deeply uncomfortable. James had already begun carving out a space where honesty wasn't a weakness, but the entire point. Songs that felt personal, exposed, almost fragile, and yet they resonated in a way that couldn't be manufactured. Standing next to him, Carole began to see what her music could become if she stopped hiding behind structure and expectation. But inspiration can also feel like pressure. James wasn't asking her to change. He didn't need to. His very presence became a mirror, reflecting everything she had been holding back for years. The shift didn't happen overnight. It came slowly, almost reluctantly. But as Carole started to write for herself, something broke open. The woman who had spent years shaping other people's voices was beginning to find her own. And while James Taylor didn't create that transformation, he made it impossible for her to ignore. Sometimes the most powerful influence isn't the one that pushes you forward, it's the one that quietly shows you that you've been standing still. Number 2. Lou Adler. Lou Adler didn't look like a man who would change the course of Carole King's life. He wasn't imposing, he wasn't loud, but he understood something that others had missed for years. Carole's voice wasn't a weakness. It was the entire story. When she stepped into the studio in Los Angeles carrying years of doubt and hesitation, Adler saw what no system, no partnership, no expectation had ever fully allowed her to see. She didn't need to hide anymore. And yet that realization didn't come easily. Carole wasn't trying to become a performer. She had spent too long behind the scenes, too comfortable letting others stand in the spotlight. The idea of putting her own voice, unpolished, unguarded at the center, felt almost unnatural. But Adler didn't push her the way others had. He didn't reshape her. Instead, he stripped everything back. The production became quieter. The arrangements became simpler. And suddenly there was nowhere left to hide. That was the risk. Because once the music was built around her voice, every hesitation, every crack, every emotion became impossible to ignore. What Adler offered wasn't control, it was exposure. And for Carole, that was terrifying. But it was also the moment everything began to change. The recording sessions that would eventually become Tapestry weren't driven by perfection. They were driven by truth. And under Adler's guidance, Carole found herself doing something she had avoided for years, telling her own story. In her own voice, without permission. It wasn't a comfortable transformation. It was quiet, uncertain, and at times overwhelming. But it was real. And for the first time in her career, that was enough. Number 1. Rick Evers. Rick Evers was not supposed to be the final turning point in Carole King's story, but in many ways, he became exactly that. By the time he entered her life, Carole had already found her voice, already proven to the world that she could stand alone. Tapestry had changed everything. The quiet songwriter from Brooklyn was no longer hidden. She was visible, respected, and finally in control of her own narrative. And that made what came next even more complicated. Rick Evers represented something Carole had always been drawn to: intensity, unpredictability, a kind of emotional force that couldn't be easily explained or contained. But where earlier relationships had blurred the line between love and control, this one pushed it further than she had ever experienced. The connection was fast-consuming and difficult to step away from once it began. And yet beneath that intensity there was a growing instability that Carole couldn't ignore. The man who had entered her life with such force began to disrupt the very balance she had fought so hard to build. The peace she had found through her music, the independence she had claimed, it all started to feel fragile again. This wasn't the controlled environment of the Brill Building. There were no systems here, no structure to rely on. Only emotion, raw and unpredictable. And for Carole, that meant facing a truth she had spent years learning. Not every powerful connection leads somewhere safe. Rick Evers didn't shape her career the way others had. He didn't guide her sound or influence her success. But he forced her to confront something far more personal: the cost of losing control again after finally finding it. And in the end, the lesson was as clear as it was painful. Finding your voice is one thing, protecting it is another. In the end, the story of Carole King was never about volume. It was never about spectacle, rebellion, or domination of the stage. While others chased the spotlight, she quietly rewrote what the spotlight could even mean. And yet, when you look closely at the path she walked, it becomes clear her journey was shaped not just by music, but by the men who stood beside her, ahead of her, and sometimes in her way. Gerry Goffin gave her a beginning, but also a reason to break away. Don Kirshner built the system that taught her discipline even as it confined her. James Taylor reflected the kind of honesty she had been holding back. Lou Adler gave her the space to finally be heard. And Rick Evers reminded her at a cost that freedom is something you have to protect once you find it. Each man left something behind. Some left scars. Others left doors open, but none of them defined her, not in the end. Because the truth is, Carole King didn't become a legend when the world started listening. She became one the moment she stopped asking for permission to be herself. The piano didn't change. The voice didn't suddenly grow louder. What changed was something far less visible and far more powerful. She chose herself. And for an audience that had spent years hearing her songs without knowing her name, that quiet decision carried more weight than any performance ever could. Even now, decades later, her music doesn't feel like something from the past. It feels like a conversation, honest, unguarded, and enduring. And maybe that's the real legacy she left behind. Not just songs that people remember, but truths they recognize long after the music fades.